you use appropriate assessment as a procedure, so you assess all plans or projects that likely have an effect, especially negative effect, to Natura 2000 sites. So, and this is an obligation, legislative obligation. So what is written in Article 6.3? Any plan or project not directly connected with or necessary to the management of the Natura 2000 site, but likely to have a significant effect thereon, either individually or in combination with other plans or projects, shall be subject to appropriate assessment and of its implications for the site in view of the site's conservation objectives. It also means that it's not necessary that this project is in Natura 2000 site. It could be something that is outside, but if there is a potential effect to the site, it should be assessed under this procedure. The continuation of this article is, of course, in the light of the conclusions of the assessment of these implications for the site and subject to the provisions of paragraph 4, the competent authority shall agree to the plan or project only if it is sure that there is no adverse impact to the integrity of the site or to conservation objectives. Of course, better is if there is also obtained opinion of the general public. So what about, in general, the appropriate assessment is an assessment of potential effects of proposed plan or projects or activities, individually or in combination, to one or even more Natura 2000 sites. What is very important, this should be based on scientific or technical data, information considerations only. So this is not a political procedure. It shouldn't be a political procedure. But in fact, in many cases in the EU countries, you can see that it's somehow influenced by this. And the aim is to assess implications on conservation objectives and to ascertain whether the proposal would affect site's integrity. There are two possible outputs or results. But the result in general should be unequivocal decision. Of course, better if this decision is that there is no significant adverse impact of given project on any of the target features assumable, plan or project then can go ahead. And of course, another decision could be that there is a proven significant adverse impact of given project to at least one of the target features of any site that is assessed. Of course, this ban is not unconditional. There is, so under some circumstances, it can be broken through, especially if there is a overriding public interest. But the directive anticipates these situations. Then there are specific reasons to authorize derogations. And I'm sure that you will hear more about it in the following two case studies. The first case study will be from Hungary. The presenter is András Schmidt from the Ministry of Agriculture. He's one of people responsible for this procedure at the country level in Hungary. So I would like to pass the floor to András now.
Thank you very much, Michael. Can you hear me? I will try to start my presentation. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for introducing me, and I also thank the EUROPARC Federation and the Central and Eastern European section of the EUROPARC Federation for inviting me. And I'd like to warmly welcome everyone on this seminar or webinar. I'd like to speak about the general structure of Natura 2000 appropriate assessment in Hungary. But in the presentation, partly because I assume that most people who are interested in the topic are already familiar with the general structure of the Habitats Directive Article 6 procedure, and partly because Michael has briefly introduced it already. I will only speak about the specificities in Hungary, and also about, as a case study, let's say, how appropriate assessment is carried out in planning, and 2 more case studies will be introduced briefly. In 2004, when Hungary joined the European Union, Hungary passed a government decree which contains most of the provisions concerning Natura 2000 sites. Article 10 contained the transposition of Article 6 of the Habitats Directive. As you can see, there is a 10A article in the government decree. This is because the first transposition was not correct, and the European Commission convinced Hungary to amend it, and I think the European Commission also agreed that now the transposition is correct. What does it contain? As for the requirements of an appropriate assessment, in the government decree there is a detailed appendix which lists all the requirements, all the aspects that the appropriate assessment documentation has to contain. It's like a book content page, and it is quite in line with the European Commission guidance document on this topic. There's another appendix of the government decree which lists the aspects that have to be taken into account when assessing the impacts, the significance of the impacts. It is a very difficult and crucial question as to decide which impact is to be considered significant and which is not. We may speak about it a bit later. And there is one more appendix which I mention here because in my 2 case studies I will speak about requesting the opinion of the European Commission. There is a format, a formula how to do this according to the government decree. In Hungary, the appropriate assessment documentation is prepared by the proponent, and experts may be involved, but it is not compulsory. I underline this because I heard earlier that in the Czech Republic, for example, there is even a test for an examination of experts, and only those experts that pass the exam that are qualified, they can carry out the appropriate assessment documentation. They can produce the appropriate assessment documentation. It varies from country to country, but in Hungary, this is how we do it. Some other specificities. In Hungary, not only the Nature Conservation Authority can carry out the appropriate assessment, but also other authorities, as I will speak about it in the forestry Article 6 procedure. There is separate legislation, not this government decree that I mentioned, but other legislation that describes how this procedure is to be carried out by the various authorities, be it a Nature Conservation Authority or forestry or other sectors authority, and how the Nature Conservation Authority has to be consulted in this procedure. In Hungary, from the beginning, the appropriate assessment is part of the strategic environmental assessment, the environmental impact assessment, or the IPPC permitting procedure, if the activity, the project or plan falls under any of these. If it does not, then the appropriate assessment is carried out separately, in that case by the Nature Conservation Authority. Another specificity in Hungary is that in addition to the Nature Conservation Authorities, we have a separate kind of administrative body, the National Park Directorate, which is responsible for managing the natural assets, the natural heritage. And the authorities regularly consult with the national park directorates on how to carry out the appropriate assessment. The first instance authorities are organized presently at county level in Hungary. You can see the arrangement of counties in Hungary. And there's a different arrangement, different territorial layout of the national park directorates in Hungary, as you can see on this map. The main point is that in any part of the country, if there is a plan or project, there is a responsible authority which will be responsible for the appropriate assessment, and there is a local national park directorate which can be involved, not only in the national park itself, but also outside protected or protected areas, or even outside Natura 2000 areas, as we heard. Any project or plan that affects a Natura 2000 site, but is outside the Natura 2000 site, that is also to undergo the appropriate assessment. And now let's look at a more specific example, how the appropriate assessment is carried out in the forestry sector. It took several years to work out this procedure, and it also took several infringement procedures against Hungary, because in the first years apparently our legislation was not in line with the Habitats Directive in this respect. But finally, I think what the two sectors, forestry and nature conservation, jointly worked out is now both in line with the Habitats Directive and also is quite operational. So in Hungary, in forestry, there are 10-year district forest management plans. These are approved by the forest authority in a permit. And in this procedure, in this approval procedure, the forest authority reviews all the possible effects of the plan. This is the screening phase. So they identify if there can be any negative impact of the forest management plan on the nature conservation values, on the trigger features, the habitats and species for which a Natura 2000 site has been designated. In this procedure, the Forest Authority uses a methodological handbook that was jointly made by the two ministries, the two ministerial departments responsible for nature conservation and for forestry. In the procedure, they consider each habitat and each species that is affected or potentially affected by the plan, and which is a trigger habitat or species of the given Natura 2000 site. In this procedure, they are obliged to involve the National Park Directorate, and with the National Park Directorate they identify the mitigation measures to lessen the impacts, the negative impacts of the forestry activities. If, despite the mitigation measures, there are significant effects remaining, then a full-scale appropriate assessment is carried out, and in this phase, they involve the Nature Conservation Authority. Here you can see just examples for how, what kind of documents, what kind of data the Forestry Authority considers on carrying out the appropriate assessment. On a given site, you can see the site name and also the habitat type, and on another site a species which is considered. And you can see that if you are familiar with the Natura 2000 system, you can see that the data that are considered, that are taken into account, they come partly from the standard data form of the given Natura 2000 site. But of course they also consider updated, very specific data from the National Park Directorate. And in this procedure, with consulting the National Park Directorate, they work out measures to prevent the long-term negative effects of the forestry activity. For example, the final cutting is certainly negative for a forest, but in order to lessen the effects, to mitigate the effects, they can make a provision that the final cutting age has to be increased, and then there is more old growth forest. So the existing trigger habitats or species can survive in those old growth forests in some areas, while the final cut areas, the final cut part of the forest grows up. And there are other possible mitigation measures, like leaving more dead wood or hollow trees, taking care of rare plants, and so on. Also for the trigger species, the example is an eagle, for which old trees with a large canopy are necessary to build a nest, the eyrie. And even in a logged area, they leave old trees so that when the new forest grows up, there are still some old trees that can hold the nest when there is already new cover from the new generation of trees. And of course, where there are existing nests, they define no felling zones around the nest and no disturbance zones in the breeding season. Then from forestry we can move on to another case study, which started about 7 years ago in Hungary. A car factory existed already, and it wanted to extend the factory buildings onto a Natura 2000 site, which affected, it was a very large extension, and it affected 200 hectares of priority habitat, the Pannonic sand steppe, on this Natura 2000 site. And the car factory claimed that there is no alternative, because partly the factory itself is surrounded by a city, partly by the Natura 2000 site. So they can only extend this building onto the site. And because it's a major development, they claim that there will be thousands of new jobs created, which was the imperative reason of overriding public interest, which is an important aspect on deciding whether a project can go ahead or not. Because it's not an environmental or public health or public safety public interest, but it's an other economic or social interest, Hungary had to request the opinion of the European Commission, and we received it within about 4 months, and it gave light to the green light to the project, that it could go ahead. But they decided that the European Commission recommended that the compensation for the lost habitats and species, especially for the habitats, should reach around 3.5 times of what is lost due to the project. This meant that several new Natura 2000 sites had to be designated if the car factory were to be allowed to be built on the Natura 2000 site. Also, other sites, existing sites, several measures had to be carried out on existing Natura 2000 sites, all for the given features that were lost on the original site where the car factory was to be built. And the same kinds of habitats and species had to be restored in other sites, other places. To summarize, it was a huge loss for nature, for the Natura 2000 network in Hungary, but at least, thanks to the Habitats Directive, some of it was compensated. Of course, a compensation area is never so valuable as an original natural or almost natural site, but still the projects have been carried out in the past 6 years, and I can say they are quite successful in creating this Pannonic sand steppe and saving some of the species that were in trouble at the other side. To achieve this, to achieve a positive opinion of the European Commission, there was an enormous economic and political pressure, both on the Hungarian government and also lobbying towards the European Commission to achieve this positive opinion. And it took about 1.5 years to prepare the project and the request for the Commission to be submitted, and then finally the Commission took only 4 months to reply. And the last case study is about a motorway on a Natura 2000 site, and also coinciding with a national park. So the site, the project development proposed this motorway affected even only the fringes of a special area of conservation, but as you can see, the blue line is the special protection area, and it also affected a national park in Hungary, in central Hungary. The problem with this was that the site here is very long. It's about 50 kilometers long north and south, and the motorway that was to be built is the plan was to build a motorway from west to east. So it was difficult to imagine to outline, design a motorway that would go around the site and would still make sense. And in addition, a bridge had already been built on the Danube, from which the motorway should have started and should have continued east. It was also part of the TEN-T. It was a TEN-T project. On the other side, from the nature conservation side, as I said, it had an impact on the national park and also on priority habitats and species. I can highlight here a critically endangered viper species, which was affected, which would have been affected by the project. And Hungary submitted a request to the European Commission for an opinion if Hungary could go on with this project, but the European Commission's opinion was that the alternatives were not properly assessed, and they also suggested the detour to go around the site. There were several rounds of correspondence with the European Commission, but and some compensation was offered, but not as much as in the car factory site, and we did not receive the green light. Finally, the proponent withdrew the project proposal, and it is presently suspended, but it has been so for several years. My opinion is that it was not successful, partly because the political lobbying was rather low and the communication between the sectors, the nature conservation and the motorway sector, the motorway planners started rather late. The overall conclusions from the presentation is that to carry out the appropriate assessment procedure correctly, it is important to transpose the Habitats Directive in a precise and very detailed way to give detailed guidance to the authorities. There has to be good communication with other sectors, and also between the levels of the different levels between the ministries. We have regular forums, for example, for the national park directorates and for the authorities on how to do the appropriate assessment procedure. And then it helps to to sort of standardize the practice of the authorities. There are also national guidance documents, as I said, for example, about the forestry sector, forestry and nature conservation sector. The European Commission guidance on the Habitats Directive Article 6 has also been translated into Hungarian and has been distributed to authorities. And as a conclusion of the conclusions, I can say that the Habitats Directive made our life certainly a lot more complicated, but it has also contributed a lot to saving our nature and ourselves. With this, I thank you for your attention, and I wish you a happy Valentine's Day today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andras.
Okay, thank you very much, Andras, too. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I hope I can see some of the questions, so I'll try to answer them in the discussion. But I hope it was clear what I wanted to say in the presentation.
Please write your questions to the chat. They will be answered later during discussion, or you can also contact presenters later if you are interested in more detailed information. But I think Andras really touched very important topics like what is a threshold for significant impact. And the next presenter, who is Stanislav, will have presentation about more site-specific approach, which is a special methodology which is used, developed and implemented in Krkonoše National Park. Definitely in Czech Republic, this is a good practice example. So he will also touch these issues. And he will also touch one very important thing, which is what is a cumulative impact of many projects in a timeline. So please, Stanislav, present us your experience.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. I thank you for invitation, and I thank Andras for very good overview of procedures in Hungary and about very instructive case studies of how the appropriate assessments is going on with large projects. My presentation is called 100 times nothing killed a donkey, and it is because this proverb describes the situation in which even a small impact can have major impact after all if it is repeated and if it is numerous and frequent. And I quote my presentation by this title because I believe that the cumulative effect of small project is maybe the most significant force that deteriorates the nature in our park, and that because although appropriate assessment is unquestionably a very good and useful procedure, it can only be really effective in conserving nature if it take into account the cumulative effect of projects it assesses. Okay, just for start, my presentation is from the Krkonoše National Park, which is in the center of Europe, and you can see that its major volume is in its geographical position between northern and southern Europe, and it is something like the cross of influences of boreal and alpine influences. A large part of the national park is covered by traditional managed mountain meadows, and we still are proud about their diversity. There is about there is 27 types of these meadows here in the Krkonoše Mountains, and the major value of the meadows is in that the mountain species from above tree line are together with normal meadow species here. In total, we have about 10,000 hectares of the meadows, and we have three major types of the meadows when we are going uphill. We have lowland hay meadows, then mountain hay meadows, and then priority objects of protection of Natura 2000, which are species rich nardus grasslands on siliceous substrates. And this is how the national park looks like, and I'm showing it because from this slide it is you can see that the most of the meadows are in buffer zone of the national park, and in the third zone of the national park it is about 98%, and in most protected areas it is the first and the second zone. We have only about 2% of the meadows. And of course, the most valuable meadows are in the places where the people live. It is because in these places the management of the meadows continues even after without interruption, even after Second World War. And the problem starts when we see how the inhabitation and how the impact of tourists is concentrated into the peripheral zone of the national park as well. The national park, Krkonoše National Park, isn't only valuable for nature, it is also highly attractive for tourists. In fact, we have very big visiting rate, which is between 5 and 8 millions of visitors a year. And these tourists need some infrastructure, they need pensions, where to live, and all which is connected with this. And the supporting infrastructure, all the pensions and hotels are often located into the meadows, which are near to the places where the people live. And you can see the second picture, how the area of the meadows is decreasing during 9 years. It was about 40 hectares of loss of meadows during this period. And what is said also is that this trend of losing the meadows continues despite the Krkonoše were designated as CI Krkonoše in 2004, and all the meadow habitats are now the objects of protection of Natura 2000. And this is also despite we have quite functional appropriate assessment procedures, which are part of EIA procedure. And despite our appropriate assessment is done by experts, which have to have licenses. Here you can see the overview of our procedures. We, as administration of national park, do the screening phase of appropriate assessment, or the quick estimate, if the project can have or cannot have the significant impact of on Natura 2000 network, and if no, then people can realize the project, and if yes, the project is going to the EIA assessment, and which is and the appropriate assessment is the part of EIA procedure. And the obvious reason why despite appropriate assessment, we still lose the meadow is that we lose them by small pieces. We usually do not assess something like car fabric, as András said, or the golf green. We usually assess very small project, very small buildings, in which we either decide that they can have impact on meadows, but then it is we pass it to EIA procedure, and the EIA procedure says that there is no significant effect actually at all, or yeah, so it is usually like this. So we said to ourselves that we have to do something with that, and we try to see the meadows and the projects in the whole. So we try to take into account the cumulative effect, and the thought was that we have to establish some limit where the loss of the meadows stops. And the thought was, and so we developed the concept of limits of percentage of total cover of the meadows. We said, okay, there is some area of the meadows in the park in the total, and we let loose some of the meadows, which is about from 1 to 6% of total area of the meadows. And if we have some other projects which will be beyond this limit, we will not allow it to be realized. We try to register all the projects, and after the limit of their the percentage limit will be attended, then we will start to say that all the other projects cannot be realized because there is some cumulative effect of all the projects on the meadows. And you can see that the limits are set according to habitat and according to quality of the habitat. The priority meadows have more strict percentage limit of their loss, and the most quality meadows have most strict limit of the quality as well. We summarize we make evidence of all the project all throughout the year, and we put it online, and it can be assessed publicly. And now we can say that the concept works, and what we are very proud of, it is accepted by the authorized experts who does the appropriate assessment. I think that it is because we developed the concept together in cooperation with the authorized persons, and because authorized persons like to use it, because in Czech Republic the appropriate assessment procedures are paid by the investor, and if you are a person who does the appropriate assessment, and you have to assess the cumulative effect, then if it is subjectively set, then you don't have the security that if your conclusion will be that the project has cumulative effect, then you are not certain that the investor will let another expert, and he will have some other opinion. So something like coordination of the limits or the public use of the limits make better environment for all the experts. and the limits are accepted by municipalities during special planning as well, because they are quite simple, and despite they sometimes seem to be quite strict, they let some space for development. And of course, the municipalities do not have only meadows which are habitats around their places. They have also some deteriorated meadows which are not habitats. And the function of these limits is to direct the development into these more deteriorated meadows which are not habitats. And we are also proud that mainly because of cooperation with NGO Amethyst, it is the Czech NGO, the concept of limits was implemented into the official methodology published by Ministry of Environment. What is still a great challenge for us is the compensatory measures, because on some places we already reached the limits, and we are certain that we are close to the time when we will need to solve it. And if I have to raise some key points from our experience, it is that I have to repeat that significant losses to the nature are not done only by big projects like car factory or by highway, but also by cumulative effect of very small projects. And that appropriate assessment can be efficient tool to reduce this pressure only if it estimates these cumulative effects really appropriately. And this can be done only in situation where we have some transparent, simple, and really consensual methodology which is used on quantitative aspects of assessment. And the important point is that any such methodology for cumulative impact is almost useless if you don't have really reliable evidence of projects which has been realized between the project you are now assessing. And this is all, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stanislav, for your case study. The list of questions from participants is getting longer, so now I would like to propose that András will go through all these questions and answer all those that are, let's say, linked somehow to Hungarian case study, and then Stanislav will do the same with questions. And please be specific when asking. So, for example, ask directly Stanislav or András if the question is just for one of our presenters. Thank you very much. So, András, may I ask you now to answer questions as listed?
Yes, thank you. I'm here again. So, if I see well, the first question is, who is obliged to invest in creating new Natura sites and restoration in case of car factory? In this case, to designate a new Natura 2000 site, it is, of course, the responsibility of the state, so the government. So in this case, because it was also the government's interest to establish this factory or to extend the factory, the government decided to choose sites that were already state-owned, and of course they had the habitat types and species that were the species lost, the species and habitats lost in the car factory site, and it was the government that designated the new sites. But no private persons had to be compensated for his land that would be designated as a Natura 2000 site. For the restoration of habitats, it was the car factory, the company, that had to pay the costs. It was quite, of course, a large amount. You can imagine it was more or less like a life project to carry out habitat restoration in a number of sites across the country. What was the public opinion in this case? How to argue against 10,000 new jobs? Now, I can say the very general public opinion was that we need the jobs and we need the car factory. It was at the time of the whole procedure started in 2009, and the European Commission opinion was received in 2011, and between there was a government change in Hungary. The administration changed, the government, and both governments were fully in favor of this project. Of course, there were NGOs and even private persons who protested against the project. There was even a public forum held for the public opinion to be expressed, and I think it also contributed to increasing the compensation because some NGOs even turned to the European Commission about it, so it was quite a big case. But of course there was pressure from both sides, but mostly the overwhelming majority of the population, if you ask, they would go for new jobs, and only a smaller a minority is really interested so much in nature that they would not have new jobs and a car factory. The next question is, were not the projects for motorway or car park assessed in an environmental impact assessment? Yes, they were, of course. Under the EIA directive, they had to be. In fact, the car factory was already it already had to undergo the appropriate assessment under the Habitats Directive in the spatial planning phase. So it did not even go at that stage to the EIA procedure, but already in the spatial planning it was clear that if the spatial plan is amended in such a way that the greenfield site is to be turned into an industrial site, then the natural values will be lost. So the appropriate assessment was carried out in this stage, and the European Commission, we asked the opinion of the European Commission in this stage, but later it went on to an environmental impact assessment, and the appropriate assessment was included into that procedure as well, in line with the Habitats Directive. So the plans and the projects are to be subjected to appropriate assessment. Next question. It has been stressed that political lobbying and intersectoral communication plays a huge role. What about the value of the site in itself or public opinion? Yes, of course the value of the site was considered in the appropriate assessment procedure, but the interest of having thousands of new jobs was considered an overriding public interest, and that was the final conclusion of the authority and also of the European Commission. Next question was, is the request for compensation of the lost habitats a very usual procedure for the European Commission? I can say yes. As far as I know, it is also included in the guidance document of the European Commission on Article 6 procedures, and it's not only a usual procedure, but even it is stressed that the compensation should go should be not only equal to the amount of habitats lost, but should exceed it, as it was in this car factory case. The proportion was 3.5 times of what was lost. The next question is, please explain how you measure the impact of compensation. I'm not sure I understand the question, but if it is how we measured the success of compensation, how we measured that the habitats were restored and were created, there was there is still a very detailed monitoring that goes together with the restoration and maintenance activities in the compensation, and the monitoring results are collected in every 2 years, and they are submitted in a report to the European Commission every 2 years. If that was the question, I hope I answered it. The local population was consulted. I'm going to the next question. Yes, in the environmental impact assessment procedure, it is part of the procedure to make the project and the project application public, and to invite anyone, not only the local population, but anyone who wants to submit an opinion. They can do it then. I think I have finished with the questions to Hungary, so I hand over to Stanislav and Mikhail. Thank you.
Thank you, Andras. You can also answer. We go first to Stanislav.
Yeah, so there is the question, how effective appropriate assessment is, and how should it be improved and changed. So, in my opinion, the appropriate assessment is quite a good tool in Kunoshe conditions when it assesses big projects. And as I said, I think that what has to be improved is the quantification of estimates of cumulative effects. But it is not only the case of appropriate assessment of itself, it is also the case of evidence of all the projects. So yeah, to improve the environment in which the appropriate assessment is proceeding. And in Czech conditions, what I think that can be improved is definitely that under current conditions, the appropriate assessment is paid by investor, developer, and it would be definitely much more useful and objective if there would be some independency between the investor and the appropriate assessment or the experts. Regarding another question, percentage limits for Krkonoše meadows, if they are forever or for a time period. According to our idea, they are of course forever, and I would like maybe to be more specific that the percentage limit and cumulative effects are not the only factor which is assessed during appropriate assessment. If we have some big project like golf green or some big hotel, then it can have major impact and significant effect on meadows despite the percentage limits are not reached. So just to be specific, that the percentage limits are just one of the limits which has to be fulfilled by appropriate assessment. And the last question, whether appropriate assessment is required for management plans of parks in your countries. It is not the case in Krkonoše Mountains. It is assumed that National Park has some experts in Natura 2000 who can make the management plans in accordance with with goals of Natura 2000 and with its objectives. And I cannot see here any other questions for me, so I pass the floor to András again.
Yes, thank you. I can see two questions addressed to both of us, Stanislav and myself. First one is quite complex procedure, and how effective has it been in, well, how effective this tool has demonstrated to be. Maybe I overstressed the fact that it's complex and makes life more complicated, but certainly it's a very effective tool for nature conservation. I should stress that. And in my last two case studies, I wanted to demonstrate that even in really big projects, which are not very numerous in our experience, at least in Hungary, we can reach, or at least it is for nature conservation, it can be a very helpful tool. The car factory has been built and nature was destroyed on a Natura 2000 site, but I cannot overemphasize that the compensation side would not have taken place without the appropriate assessment procedure and without the Habitats Directive. Only based on national legislation, there may not have been any compensation or very limited. Also, in the motorway case, for nature conservation, I can say this is relatively positive. It is a positive development that finally the motorway was the project plan was withdrawn, and a motorway was not built across a national park. Of course, there are two sides of this. Public opinion in general may not be in favor of nature conservation so much, but for nature conservation, it's certainly a good development, and maybe the planners, if they want to go on with the project, they have to think a bit more about how to mitigate further the impacts. How could it be improved? I think what I mentioned was more and more guidance documents as the European Commission works on such guidance documents, the distribution of these guidance documents. It can be very helpful, more communication with the authorities. And I can say that the Czech example is very positive for me, where experts are authorized and examined and then authorized, and only those experts can carry out the appropriate assessment. They can draft the documentation of the appropriate assessment. So I can really say it's a good example. I'm not certain we can introduce it in Hungary, but maybe I can recommend it to other countries. There is one more question for the two of us about the appropriate assessment, if it is required for the management plans of parks in our countries. If you mean the management plans of such as national parks, because they are positive for nature, by nature they are positive. They are not supposed to have negative impacts on the trigger species and trigger habitats. They do not undergo an appropriate assessment in Hungary. But I'm interested in, of course, the situation in other countries, maybe in the Czech Republic. Stanislav? So I think I can hand over here to Stanislav or anyone else who wants to say more about the questions.
Stanislav, would you like to add anything? Okay, until we hear Stanislav back, I will just like to information about the next EUROPARC webinars. We will be organizing at least one webinar per month, and the next webinar will be on March, on the 28th of March. You will soon receive an invitation to join the webinar. It will be focused on the subject health and protected areas. On April, we will be focusing on sustainable tourism. And in May, we'll have European policy for protected areas. And you can always follow the latest news of EUROPARC on our social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or on our website. And I would like also to invite you, if you have any opinion, suggestion, or if you would like to join as a case study presenter in any of the next webinars, please write me an email to b.pais@europarc.org. We'll be glad to hear your suggestions. Thank you again. All information will be available in a EUROPARC website tomorrow. Thank you and goodbye.